Welcome to Pressure Point. I'm Marilou Carrillo.
And I'm Brad Newcombe. The United Church of Canada is the largest Protestant church in Canada, and every 2 years elects a moderator, the spiritual leader of the church. We're pleased to welcome to this program the current moderator, Marion Best, and she's a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. She's been an active layperson and volunteer in the church for many years, an educator, a former emergency room nurse, a mother and a grandmother. Welcome, Marion. It's great to have you here.
Welcome, Marion.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Marilou.
Marion, I know that you weren't raised in the United Church, and here you are now, the spiritual leader of the church. How did you get connected to the United Church of Canada?
I guess my first connections were when I was nursing, and some of my nursing classmates attended a United Church, and so I went with them a few times, not regularly, but a few times. And then when Jack and I were married in the United Church because his family was part of the church. And it was a year or so after we were married, the birth of our first child, that I really felt called to have this child baptized.
What was it that, I mean, if, you know, was there anything special that made you want to have your child baptized, or was it just something that people do?
People do.
Because there are a lot of people like that.
Yeah. Well, no, it was more that her birth was a really a mystical experience. That's the only way I could describe it. It was 40 years ago, back before natural childbirth was in vogue, and I just had the kind of birth where the experience was one that I was wide awake for, remembered, and at the time of her birth felt, this is a child of God, and I would like her to be part of a community of faith.
Now, what was the response then when you went to the community of faith and to the minister, first of all, because you hadn't been, you know, one of the most involved people in that congregation, I take it?
No. Well, he had married us,
Yeah.
and except for a couple of Sundays we attended, no, he didn't really know me. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, well, you know, are you interested in becoming a member of the church? And at that point I said, oh, I don't know enough to become a member, but I really would like this child to be baptized. So he explained to me the vows, to both Jack and I, the vows that we would be taking. And I thought, oh, I could say yes to those, not realizing that they're almost the same vows you take when you join the church. And so anyway, she was baptized, and within a year I did become a member.
And then, of course, this has taken you on a journey that, you know, I'm sure, I mean, it's a long way. I mean, you've been serving the church in many, many ways. So something really grabbed you, didn't it? I mean, it's been a real, can you say something about that? Something about that journey that from there, from the baptism?
Well, I think a really significant part of the journey, too, was because we take vows when other children are baptized in the church. And I would take the vows that I would help to raise the children in the congregation in the Christian faith. So then when they asked me to teach Sunday school, and by that time we already had 4 children in the church school, it was hard to say anything except, well, yes, I think I would be willing to do that, but I'll need help because I don't know how to teach, I don't know the Bible very well. And at that point, a group of us taught together. We were sent off for teacher training, and there was a regular Bible study group that we participated in. So that really was the beginning of a deepening faith journey for me.
And so the baptism of your child was an entrance into the church, but
Yes.
Some people stay in churches and some people don't. So what made you stay?
What made me stay? I think a lot of it was the learning that happened for me, the deepening of faith, a place where my gifts and skills were not only used, but I felt really empowered around it. I had lots of opportunities for working in teams with people, and some very good learning experiences.
Because I'm a lay woman as well in the church, and often it's not always clear how lay people, particularly lay women, get that empowerment.
Well, I think to be honest, I came at a time when women were starting to be more recognized, and I think there was an openness to having women more involved in the courts of the church. And I know that I had a number of opportunities that were challenging and empowering, and I received lots of support and encouragement. Now, there were also some points in there where there was some discouragement, but by that time I felt so committed and so empowered in so many ways that, as I would put it, I hung in through some tough periods. And the church has been a home and really a place of empowerment for me.
I read that you said that when you came into the church, Marion, one of the things that you said was that you came asking questions, and that you appreciated the intellectual openness that the United Church offered, and that you weren't turned away for the questions that you brought.
Right.
What were some of those questions that you came? I mean, you obviously had some things that were nagging inside you.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that had happened when I was a child was that I did go to a Sunday school, and it wasn't a United Church Sunday school, but it was one where the Bible was taken more literally, and I had some difficulty with that. So as a result, when I came into that Bible study group that I talked about, I really wanted to be able to push on the whole business of myth and poetry and legend in Scripture, and not to be seen as saying I don't think the Bible is true, but true in a different way than a literal way of understanding it. So that was one. And certainly questions around the whole business of the divinity and humanity of Jesus, questions about the Trinity, and all of those things. It seemed as though there was anything was okay to ask in that study group.
You know, there's a survey that has just come out recently by Reginald Bibby. It was sponsored by the United Church, and I know you know all about it, but I mean, in that he talks about over 3 million Canadians identify themselves with the United Church on the census, but they're really not super involved. You sound like you would fit right into that group. Is there a place for people in the church who want to have a conversation but have lots of doubts?
Well, I think there is if congregations make them welcome and if congregations provide a place for them. I have a friend who said laughingly one day, I wish there was a doubters group in my church because they offer Bible study groups, but I don't feel as though I know the Bible very well. There's not a lot of family support for going to church these days, and I just wish there was a place where I could just go and talk about the doubts and the competition that there is. The kids want to go on the ski hill, another one wants to practice hockey. What am I supposed to do on Sunday? And so as a result, that congregation did start a group, and they called it an inquirers group, where she went. And then I understand now that that congregation has set up a second service that's intergenerational in nature, and it's one that people who don't have a history in the church can come into, feel at home in, and not feel as though I don't know enough to be here. And they still have the inquirers group.
So if we could get back to just talking about your journey as a leader of the largest Protestant church in Canada, how would you see that journey? And you're talking about your participation when you first entered the church and your relationship with other people in congregations today. But you know, I was very aware coming to this visit with you that you are perhaps the most prominent woman leader in a church in the Western world. So could you talk about how that journey went in terms of your involvement and what some of that spiritual development and practical development went?
Well, I would say the working with children and youth was the foundation, because in order to work with them, I had to do more study. I had to have a deepened prayer life. And I think a lot of the learning I did at Naramata was really significant for me.
Can you say a little bit about the kind of learning that would be?
About the kind of learning it was?
Well,
it was very much based on reflection on experience. Either it was reflection on past experience, or it was having an experience on the spot and reflecting on it. And particularly to try to make sense out of, to try to make meaning, to find meaning in, and to make connections between the biblical stories and my own story, to make connections between the biblical stories and what was going on in the community or globally. And it certainly stretched me in terms of looking beyond my own congregation into, and then I became involved in the national church in a variety of ways. And Theology and Faith Committee and Interchurch Interfaith, which was an expanding learning opportunity too.
And now, of course, you represent the church as moderator of the United Church of Canada and, of course, on the World Council of Churches. Just in further to the comments about your journey to this position, when you're in the World Council of Churches and when you're traveling around the world, the church is a pretty male-dominated institution, and a lot of the other leaders in the churches are men. And I mean, you deal with Orthodox and unorthodox and so on. So how do you relate to these Orthodox priests, and maybe more interestingly, how do they relate to you?
Well, I would say there's been significant changes in World Council of Churches in the last, probably the last 15 years. Slowly, more women have been coming into prominent positions in the staff and in the volunteer part of World Council. So that right now on the executive committee where I sit, out of 26, there are 10 women. So that's much different than when Pauline Webb would talk about her days when there were 2 women on that committee. So there are more women. And I think that at first there is a wondering, as a lay woman, how could you possibly be spiritual head of a church when you're not ordained? That question does come up. And there wouldn't be many churches that would have lay women, that would have women at all, and then that would have lay women. But on the whole, I find that I can function quite well there. I think I've been there now almost 4 years. And so there's a measure of respect that builds and back and forth. We certainly don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, but there is a respect and there is that kind of unity and diversity there.
But although that women have had more visibility in a body like the World Council of Churches, still there's that the notion of what I would call the priestly caste, in contrast to what we call lay person. So what is the answer to the question, how does a lay person get this leadership role?
Well, I think one of the things that in our own church, we've always talked about the importance of lay people's ministry in the world. And I think that that's an important thing for us to stay aware of when we're in, as a lay person, when I'm with order of ministry people, is to keep bringing in the experiences of daily life in the world. And certainly, while I did work as a nurse at one time, then I went to work at Naramata Center as an educator. So it was as though I worked in the church at that point. But half of my work was with secular groups. So I worked with hospital staffs, with library staffs. I mean, you know, it was very much a secular interaction I had as an educator too, so that I think I was always very much aware of people living out their lives, not in the church, but in the world, and how that interaction relates to our faith.
And now, any significant difference in terms of working with secular groups or church groups, or same questions about meaning, or what are your observations there?
One of the hardest ones for me was that I did a lot of conflict resolution. And in the church, it's possible to appeal to the whole notion of reconciliation and grace, confession, repentance. When you're with a secular group, you don't use those words, but I know I would end up saying to people, like, forgiveness is really an important thing here. And if for no other reason than for your own health, it's important that you not carry resentment and carry anger around with you, but that you find a way to forgive. Not to forget, but to forgive in order to be able to move on. Now, you get to that point after you've done a lot of work with the conflict. But still, there comes a point with conflict resolution where you really do have to move towards some kind of reconciling mode.
Now, that's interesting, because I mean, ethics is a growing concern in our society and so on, and we all come from different positions. So I'm wondering, what is the foundation? Because you know, in the Christian tradition, there's a story, you know, of forgiveness and so on. So what is the foundation upon which then a secular group would move to that understanding of forgiveness?
Well, as I say, it was often based on what would reduce stress, what would keep them being healthier people who could function effectively. And so we'd use those kinds of words. But in my own mind, what I would be thinking about is the whole business of confession. You know, we need to say, what's gone wrong here? What part did I play in it? And then we need to talk about wishing we'd done it differently, repentance, and then move towards some reconciliation. So I didn't use those words, but in fact it's the same steps.
It's the movement of the Spirit, isn't it? Using different language. The other aspect that's interesting in terms of so-called secular and church communities is the understanding of ministry, and it constantly surprises me how many lay people never see their work in the world as ministry. So when we ask that question in a church setting, the response is, well, I teach Sunday school, that's my ministry. And people don't think of connecting their work as a nurse, as a teacher, working in an office as ministry. As ministry,
Yeah, when I was nursing, I did work in the emergency department and intensive care. And there were so many opportunities for ministry there. It was incredible, particularly with families, if not with the patients, with their families, because often they were in such a state of shock and disbelief about what was happening in their families, and there was lots of opportunity for ministry there. And I often thought, you know, should I have stayed nursing instead of going to work for the church? Because it was an important ministry, and I saw it as a ministry at the time too.
And dealing very much with life and death issues and so on. I know that you've traveled in the Third World, Africa in particular. What are some of the things you've learned through your African experiences?
Well, I've been to Africa twice, and for a total of maybe 3 or 4 months altogether in those 2 trips. And both times when I'm there, I just have this incredible sense of people having this sense of hope and belief that the Spirit is with them, and they have this deep sense of faith. And then I come home and I watch the television, and I sometimes start to feel depressed because of what I see on TV. But when I'm there with the people, it's just remarkable, the strength they have and the spirit that they have. And one of the things that happened for me on my first trip to Africa was being in a vehicle where we stopped to refuel, and it was in Tanzania. It was winter there and raining, and a youngster about 10 years old was standing by the side of the road, no shirt and a pair of shorts full of holes, no shoes, and it was cool. So my first thought was, I'll give him my shirt. You know, so I went to the truck and got out my backpack. And he was a child that was mentally disabled probably because of malnutrition, as many of the children are. And when I came back, there were 3 children. And I only had 1 shirt. I had the one I was wearing and one in my backpack. And I knew then if I gave that shirt to one of the children, there'd be a struggle over it and somebody would be hurt or whatever. So I just had to take it back. And that's when I realized that charity, which was my first inclination, was, oh, I can share some of what I have, was not going to change the situation there.
And I'm also hearing that the charity actually heightened the inequality.
Yeah. And what I learned while I was there was that the sisal fields that had been their way of making a living were now gone to ruin because people use nylon rope in the West now. They don't use sisal anymore. So they were being encouraged to grow coffee. so that they could pay the interest on their debts, and they needed to pay with cash crops where they could get foreign currency. But in fact, what was happening is they would grow the crops, but the cost of gas and oil was 5 times what it used to be. They couldn't manage to pick up the crops, and so sometimes they grow them and they'd rot there because the cost of coffee, they were getting less for their coffee and paying 4 times more for gas and oil. Now, how could they ever get out of that mode? So that's when I knew that I had to understand more about global economics than I did. And it really helped me understand about structural adjustment programs and what that does to the South.
So from your standpoint as moderator, how does that translate in terms of the church community, the church structures, and global inequality, global stress?
Well, I think one of the things is that we've always, as a church, put an emphasis on justice and on social issues and wanting to be involved nationally and globally. But what we're hearing more and more from people in the church is they would like to pick and choose where their mission and service dollars go. They have projects that they would rather support and other ones they don't want to support. But we've always worked on the basis of a unified budget where people donate to the Mission and Service Fund, and that's what keeps the projects going. But I think we have to find ways for people to hear the stories and know more directly and clearly what they are funding, and to hear about specific projects where their dollars are going.
And specific people, like the story you've just told. I mean, because that tells me a story and it gives me a picture and something that I can go away and think about, as opposed to the other becomes words for me and I get a little lost. You know?
Well, and we are in partnership with these partners around the world, and we do leave a lot of the decisions about what they will fund up to them. And we also tend to want to support workers in those countries rather than us, quote, sending people there to do the work, because there are people who live in Africa who are quite skilled and can be doing the work. We don't need to send people from here. But people more think we're paying for a missionary to go or whatever, and we're doing less and less of that and being in partnership with people in other parts of the world.
And what about the inequality and the marginalization within our society, within our church?
Within our church.
What do we do about that?
The marginalization of, you're thinking like youth and young adults, for instance, who don't seem to be able to find a place.
Well, ethnic persons, gays and lesbians, you know, many ways that we marginalize people in structures that have been there for so long. We just haven't learned to shift some of our focus.
If I could add, though, I mean, I did want to ask you, Marion. I mean, I know that you were very, very involved in the process that the United Church went through in the decision to ordain gays and lesbians in 1988, and you were part of that General Council, and in fact chaired the sessional committee that brought that report there. So, what has that meant to you? Because that's been a pretty significant movement in terms of social change, both within the church and I think within society. But I'm asking you, what has it meant to you? Not just the church, but to you.
Yeah, to me personally. Well, I think that one of the things that I felt really positive about in relation to the stand that we took was that we said that all persons can be full members of the United Church. And that, I mean, that meant a lot to me, because you see all kinds of congregations that have little signs that say everyone welcome, but in this statement we refused to take out the phrase that said regardless of their sexual orientation. And a lot of people wanted to take that phrase out, but lots of churches say everyone welcome, but they don't mean everyone welcome. Well, now I think it's pressed us to reconsider, and I think there has been a considerable movement where I know that not every congregation would openly welcome gay, lesbian people, but there are a lot that have welcomed these people, and there are a lot of people who are in ministry now and are being open about their orientation, which I think allows them an integrity in their lives that I would wish for anyone.
And another unique movement by the United Church is the recent establishment of the Ethnic Ministries Council, and And in listening to the speeches by the young persons of that council, was very moving, because their theme was, we are here, we have been here, where is our voice, where are the faces that, that would represent me in this church?
Well, see, I think that was a very significant move by this General Council, and it'll have to be followed up with dollars to put it in place, but at the last executive meeting we did vote for the first amount of money to be put into making that council a reality. And there has to be a movement towards translation and more staff people of different ethnic groups, and I think that's going to come for sure. I do.
You also talked about your role in conflict resolution earlier, and also that we've heard that you are a very effective person in processes of change, both in group processes as well as in communities. So what would you reflect on in terms of your experience of actually doing things differently and producing change?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge that change is inevitable. There's been a lot of change going on, and sometimes we've tried to deny it. You know, we haven't acknowledged the depth of the change, and that's the first thing we have to do, is acknowledge it. But when you do that, a lot of times people go into a kind of grief, because change doesn't come easily for most of us. Some really like change and thrive on it, but most people don't like change. They'd really prefer things to stay the way they were. And we can't go back, and so that often leaves people grieving. And you know about the grief process. I mean, we get into anger and depression and apathy, and then once there's an acceptance, then we can move on. And I think that's the stage we're at now. I think we've experienced a lot of anger. I think there's been quite a lot of depressed feelings that have led us into a kind of apathy. It's as if we haven't been able to move because we just haven't been sure. And now I think as we can acknowledge the change and we can say we're not powerless, we have some choices in change, and what are those choices and what do we choose to do? And some congregations will choose to die, and they'll do it creatively so that others may live.
Yeah, but others will carry on, and there'll be new life and so on.
That's right, and lots of new church development happening in places too, new life.
It's been great having you here on Pressure Point. I'd love to talk to you more and more, but and you've got a busy schedule. You also have a book called Marion, Best and Friends, Will the Church Disappear? That's available at the United Church Book Room on 1955 4th Avenue. So thanks, Marion, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marion.
Thanks, Marilou.
You've been watching Pressure Point, and we've been talking with Marion Best, the current moderator of the United Church of Canada. If you have any comments on this program, there will be a phone number coming up for on the screen after the program. Please let us know, and also if you have any topics that you'd like to have us talk about in the future, please give us a call. Thanks for watching. I'm Brad Newcombe.
The preceding program was produced through the facilities of Rogers Community 4, Vancouver. We want to hear from you and invite you to leave your comments and suggestions on our 24-hour response line message machine. Please call 731-5812.